Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I am Dr. Hind Hassan, Assistant Lecturer of Human Anatomy and Embryology. Inshallah, the last topic to be discussed will be the internal structure of the cerebral hemisphere, and also we will take different sections in the brain. We will see inside each cerebral hemisphere the following. We will find basal ganglia. The term basal ganglia describes group of nuclei deeply embedded in the cerebral hemisphere. Also, we will see different types of nerve fibers, and we will find the cavity, which is the lateral ventricle. We will start by the basal ganglia. Anatomically, basal ganglia include caudate nucleus and lentiform nucleus. Both are called corpus striatum. We will find also amygdaloid nucleus and the colostrum. About the arrangement of this nuclei, we will find the caudate nucleus, the greenish one. It is C-shaped nucleus. It is formed of head, followed by body, then the tail of caudate, which is continuous anteriorly in the temporal lobe as the amygdaloid nucleus. We will find also lateral to the head of caudate this nucleus, which is the lentiform nucleus. And we will find that the lentiform nucleus is pyramidal-shaped nucleus. It has medial part called globus pallidus, and the lateral part called putamen. And also remember that the thalamus is related to both lentiform laterally and also body of caudate laterally. And also please know that in between the thalamus and the body of caudate, you will find fibers called stria terminalis connecting the amygdaloid nucleus with the septal area. I mentioned septal area before, that it is connected with the hapenular nucleus via the stria medullaris thalami. So, according to the arrangement of caudate nucleus, we have C-shaped caudate nucleus. Its tail terminate as or be continuous with the amygdaloid. Lateral to the head, we will find the lentiform, and this lentiform is also lateral to the thalamus. In a horizontal section, this is a horizontal section in the cerebrum. We divide the brain into into upper and lower parts, and we remove the upper part and look to the lower part from the superior aspect. We will find these structures. We will find the head of caudate most medial, and we will find it separated by fibers called internal capsule from the lentiform that I told you that it is pyramidal in shape. The lentiform nucleus has medial part called globus pallidus and lateral part called putamen. Also, thalamus is present medially, and so this cavity will be the third ventricle, and this is the opposite thalamus. So, lentiform nucleus is lateral to both head of caudate and thalamus. It is separated by the internal capsule by both structures, but the internal capsule is V-shaped. It has anterior limb separating the head of caudate from the lentiform and posterior limb separating the lentiform from the thalamus. Internal capsule is example of nerve fibers in the cerebral hemisphere, and we will know. What about the colostrum, which is a part of the basal ganglia? Colostrum lies lateral to the lentiform. So this part, this is the colostrum. So caudate is medial. Lateral to it we have the lentiform, and most laterally we will find the colostrum. Okay. What about nerve fibers? We have three types of nerve fibers, either commissural, association, or projection fibers. Commissural fibers like corpus callosum, as we mentioned before. It connects the same areas, but in the two cerebral hemispheres, and so these commissural fibers must pass in the midline. So, if you take a sagittal section in the brain, you will find these fibers on the medial surface. But what about association? Association connects two different areas, but in the same cerebral hemisphere. What about projection? It connects cortical with subcortical areas, like the internal capsule. This is a horizontal section, as we know before, and this will be the corpus callosum seen on the midline. This will be the genome, then the body, and the splenium of corpus callosum. Corpus callosum connect the same areas in both cerebral hemispheres. So we will find extension from the genu connecting the two frontal lobes together. It is called forceps minor. We will find also extension from the splenium connecting the two occipital lobes together. It is called forceps major. We will also see radiation from the body of corpus callosum connecting the two parietal lobes together. And lastly, we will find extension from the junction between the body and the splenium of corpus callosum called the tapetum, and it connects the two temporal lobes together. And also in this section, I'd like to know some relations. You will find the tapetum, which is extension or part of corpus callosum connecting the temporal lobes together. And lateral to it, you will find the optic radiation. Optic radiation starts at the lateral geniculate body and terminates in area 17, or the primary visual area. And lateral to optic radiation, you will find example for association fibers called inferior longitudinal fasciculus. It connects the temporal with the occipital lobe. So, usually, when you find the tapetum, you will find lateral to it optic radiation and the inferior longitudinal fasciculus. So remember the word toy. What about the cavity of the cerebral hemisphere, which is the lateral ventricle? What about the side? This is a sagittal section in the brain. This is the left half of the brain. This is the left cerebral hemisphere. This is the medial surface known from the corpus callosum. Here we remove a midline septum, separating two lateral ventricles from each other. So this cavity will be the lateral ventricle. What about its shape and its different parts, and also what about the communications? When you look, the greenish colored cavity, this is the lateral ventricle. It is C-shaped. It has anterior horn in the frontal lobe. It has central part of or body in the parietal lobe. It has inferior horn in the temporal lobe, and finally the posterior horn in the occipital lobe. What about communications? The lateral ventricle, as we mentioned before, communicates with the third ventricle through the interventricular foramen of Monro. What about relations of different parts of the ventricle on each side? When you look at the shape and the different parts of each lateral ventricle, you will find that the ventricle is not vertically located inside the cerebral hemisphere, it is obliquely located. I mean, some parts are close to the midline and some parts are away from the midline. The parts which are close to the midline are the anterior horn and the central part, while the posterior and the inferior horns are away from the midline. So, if you have a septum between the two lateral ventricles, and this septum will be known as septum pellucidum, this septum will be related laterally only to the anterior horn and body of corpus callosum. And this septum will not relate at all to the inferior or the posterior horns. Also, what about the choroid plexus of the lateral ventricle? It is needed for production of CSF. It is the largest choroid plexus because the lateral ventricle is the largest ventricle in the brain. This choroid plexus is situated in the floor of the central part of the lateral ventricle and in the medial wall of its inferior horn. So, anterior and posterior horns have no choroid plexus. What about relation of the corpus callosum to the lateral ventricle? These are the four parts of the corpus callosum. Here we remove the midline septum, which is called septum pellucidum, and so this cavity will be the lateral ventricle. We will find this is the site of the anterior horn, and we will find that the anterior horn is related to three parts of corpus callosum. We will find the rostrum forming its floor. The genu is anteriorly, while the body of corpus callosum forms its roof. What about here? Here is the site of the posterior horn of the lateral ventricle. This is related medially to the splenium of corpus callosum. What about the central part of the lateral ventricle? It is related to the body of the corpus callosum above. What about the relation of the caudate nucleus? We know that it is C-shaped nucleus having head, body, and tail, and the tail is continuous with the amygdaloid nucleus. What is the relation of this C-shaped nucleus to this C-shaped cavity? We will find the head of caudate deep or lateral to the anterior horn, while body of caudate forms the floor of the central part of the lateral ventricle, while the tail as well as the amygdaloid nucleus forms the roof of the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle. Another important relation, we know the fornix before. The fornix starts medial to the hippocampus as fimbria, and the firmia followed by cross, and the two crura formed below the splenium to form the body of the fornix. And I told you before that the body of the fornix forms the roof of the diencephalon here. The body of the fornix also lies in the midline, like the corpus callosum, and the space between body of corpus callosum above and body of the fornix below will be occupied by a vertical membrane called septum pellucidum. Also, this is for the fornix. Fornix starts as fimbria, and fimbria is covers the medial surface of the hippocampus. Then in the midline, you will find the body of the fornix that will divide into column terminating at the mammillary body. This is the body of corpus callosum, and this is the body of the fornix. So this gap will be occluded by septum pellucidum, which is related laterally to both anterior horn and body of lateral ventricle. What about the stria terminalis? I told you before that stria terminalis starts at the amygdaloid nucleus in the temporal lobe and passes between the thalamus medially and the body of caudate laterally to reach the septal area below the rostrum. Again, this is the stria terminalis. It usually terminates at the amygdaloid nucleus, at the septal area, but it can terminate at another sites like anterior perforated substance of the anterior hypothalamic nucleus, but mainly it begins at the amygdaloid and terminates at the septal area. It passes between the thalamus medially and the body of caudate laterally. Let's take the first section in the brain. It is a horizontal section. And as we said before, this section divides the brain into superior and inferior parts. And this section passes by two parts of the corpus callosum. Usually, it passes by the genu and the splenium. And so, remember that the genu was related to the anterior horn and the splenium also was related to the posterior horn of the lateral ventricle. So, when you take a horizontal section, you will see two different parts of corpus callosum, which are genu and splenium. And also you will find two parts of the lateral ventricle, which are the anterior horn and the posterior horn. So this is the horizontal section. So firstly, the two parts of corpus callosum, genu and splenium. Also, two parts of the lateral ventricle. This is the anterior horn, and this will be the posterior horn. What about the arrangement of the nuclei? Firstly, we will find the caudate nucleus. As I told you before, it is lateral to the anterior horn. Its head is lateral to the anterior horn. Also, you will find the thalamus paramedian, so this cavity is the third ventricle. Also, I told you that caudate nucleus is separated from the pyramidal nucleus, which is lentiform nucleus, which is lateral to it. Lentiform was related laterally to the colostrum, and the colostrum more laterally, you will be in the bottom of the lateral sulcus, where you find area of the cerebral cortex called the insula. So from medial to lateral, you can find caudate, then lentiform, then colostrum, and the most lateral will be the insula in the bottom of the lateral sulcus. These areas or nuclei are separated from each other by fibers. Firstly, we will separate caudate and lentiform and thalamus from the lentiform nucleus, as we know before, by the internal capsule, which has anterior limb, genu, and posterior limb. We will separate the lentiform nucleus from the colostrum by the external capsule. And finally, we will separate by the extreme capsule, we will separate the colostrum medially from the insula in the bottom of the lateral sulcus, laterally. Okay. This is the horizontal section. Look at this specimen. This is for the horizontal section of the cerebral hemisphere. We divide the cerebral hemisphere into upper and lower parts. And I told you before that when we take a horizontal section, we will find the two parts of corpus callosum. Usually they are the genu and the splenium. Here we have letter G for the genu and S for the splenium. Also remember that genu was related to the anterior horn of the lateral ventricle. Genu was anterior to the anterior horn, while the splenium was related medially to the posterior horn of the lateral ventricle. Look at the anterior horn, you will find some relations. You will find medially the septum pellucidum separating it from the anterior horn of the opposite lateral ventricle. Also laterally, you will find the letter C refers for the head of caudate. Also, you will find the letter T for thalamus, and remember that the two thalami are separated by midline cavity known as the third ventricle. Also, you know that the internal capsule projection fibers separate caudate and thalamus medially from the lentiform nucleus laterally. And the internal capsule was formed of three parts. Here we will find AL for the anterior limb of the internal capsule separating the head of caudate medially from the lentiform nucleus laterally, and the posterior limb BL separating the lentiform laterally from the thalamus medially. Also, if you look lateral to the lentiform nucleus, you will find letters IN refers for insula in the bottom of the lateral sulcus. What about taking coronal sections of the brain? This is a coronal section dividing the brain into anterior and posterior parts. We will take coronal sections at different levels. The first level will be at the level of the anterior horn of the lateral ventricle. So this is a sagittal section in the brain, and this is the medial surface known by corpus callosum. You will find in the midline with the corpus callosum septum pellucidum, and here is the body of the fornix as we know. This is the lateral ventricle parts, and this is the parts of the caudate nucleus. What about the level? This is the level, passing here by the anterior horn. What about relations of the anterior horn to be collected and draw it? Firstly, we will find it related to the rostrum of corpus callosum below, body of corpus callosum above, septum pellucidum medially separating it from the anterior horn of the lateral ventricle of the opposite cerebral hemisphere, and lateral to the anterior horn you will find the head of caudate. So try to draw. This is the anterior horn. So the roof will be body of corpus callosum. The floor will be rostrum of corpus callosum. Medially this is septum pellucidum, and laterally this is the head of caudate. The same. And there is a characteristic shape for the corpus striatum as it related to the anterior horn. When you see a coronal section in the brain and you see this U-shaped structure, remember that this is the level of the anterior horn. This U-shape reveals the head of caudate and the lentiform nucleus, while in between the anterior limb of the internal capsule. What about taking a coronal section at another level? Level 2 will be at the level of body and the inferior horns of the lateral ventricle. Here we will cut at this level, and this level also passes by the mammillary bodies in the interpeduncular fossa. What about this level? When you cut this level, you will see the body and also the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle. But we will separate both parts to know the relation of each part alone. We will start by the body. Here is the cut section. When we cut the body, we will find the body of caudate nucleus forming the floor of the body of the lateral ventricle. Okay? But I told you before that the body of caudate nucleus was related medially to the thalamus, and in between stria terminalis pus. So the floor of the body of the lateral horn will be formed by thalamus and body of caudate with stria terminalis in between. What about the choroid plexus? I told you before that the choroid plexus was present in the floor of the body also. So the floor will be made of thalamus, body of caudate, structures in between, and also the choroid plexus. What about the roof? I told you that the roof is formed by the body of corpus callosum. So we can draw the body of the lateral ventricle. This is the roof. This is body of corpus callosum. What about the floor? From lateral to medial, you have body of caudate, number 3. Number 6, the thalamus. And in between, we have structures like stria terminalis and thalamostriate vein. What is the medial wall? Medial wall will be made by the septum pellucidum, as I told you before, and it fills the gap between body of corpus callosum above and body of the fornix below. Also in the floor, you will find the choroid plexus. What about the lateral wall? Lateral wall is formed by meeting of the roof and the floor. This is the body. So the cavity, which will be formed inside, or which will be found in between the two thalami, will be the third ventricle. I told you that in the same section, you can find the inferior horn, but I separate it to know its relations. This is the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle. Its roof will be made by the tail of caudate. Also, in the medial wall of the inferior horn, you will find the choroid plexus. What about other relations? What about the floor of the inferior horn? If you enter deeply in the inferior surface of the brain or the cerebral hemisphere, you will find the collateral sulcus and the parahippocampal gyrus are opposite the floor of the inferior horn. So, collateral sulcus producing elevation inside the floor of the inferior horn. And the parahippocampal gyrus, I told you before that it contains the area called the hippocampus, which is covered on its medial surface by the fimbria. So, both hippocampus and the fimbria, as well as the collateral sulcus, producing impressions for them on the floor of the inferior horn. And we will see. This is view for the fimbria that cover the medial surface of the hippocampus. So we will draw the inferior horn. About the roof, it will be the tail of caudate nucleus. About the medial wall, you will find the choroid plexus. About the floor, I told you that you have two impressions. One opposite the collateral sulcus, it is called collateral trigone or collateral eminence, and another one medial to it, it is for the hippocampus and the fimbria covering its medial surface. What about the lateral wall? Remember that the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle is situated in the lateral, in the temporal lobe. And in the temporal lobe, you remember that we have 3 structures passing from medial to lateral, which are toy for tapetum, optic radiation, and inferior longitudinal fasciculus. So, again, the roof is tail of caudate, floor, collateral eminence, and area or elevation related to the hippocampus covered on its medial surface by the fimbria. Medially, you will find the choroid plexus, and laterally toy. What about taking another coronal section at the level of the posterior horn of the lateral ventricle? We will cut here. Okay. If we cut here, we will find the posterior horn located deep to the splenium. What about relations? If we cut here, we will find also that the cut touches or gets the calcarine sulcus. So both splenium and the calcarine sulcus having impressions on the medial wall of the posterior horn. This is a horizontal section. In this horizontal section, I told you before that we will find 2 parts of corpus callosum, mostly genu and splenium. Also, we'll find the 2 parts of lateral ventricle, anterior and posterior horns. Also, you will find lateral to the posterior horn, the toy, as the structures were lateral to the inferior horn. What about the floor of the posterior horn? The floor lies opposite the collateral sulcus. So you will find the floor having impression corresponds to the collateral sulcus known as collateral eminence. Okay, these are the three structures related laterally, which are the word toy. So collect the relations of the posterior horn. I told you that medially we have two impressions. One for the splenium and the other one opposite the calcarine sulcus. So medially you will find bulb. This corresponds to the forceps major, which are the fibers that arise from the splenium. And we have calcar aves related to the collateral sulcus, calcarine sulcus. And in the floor, we have impression, elevation, opposite the collateral sulcus, called collateral trigone, and laterally you will find toy. Look at this model. This is a coronal section in the lateral ventricle at the level of the anterior horn. How we know that this is the anterior horn of the lateral ventricle? When you look laterally to the cavity situated, which is the for letter A refers for the anterior horn, you will find lateral to it, as I told you, a C-shaped structure. Here it take letters CS, refers for the corpus striatum. Corpus striatum refer for caudate and lentiform nucleus. So you will find the anterior horn, the letter A, is related medially to the septum pellucidum and related laterally to the corpus striatum. And also, if you find the roof of the anterior horn, you will find part of corpus callosum. Here, G refers for the genu. I told you that the roof of the anterior horn is made by body of corpus callosum. This when we take... This is another coronal section at the level of body of corpus callosum. We know that we are in the body from seeing a central cavity in the midline. V is for the third ventricle. So T will be the thalamus, lateral to the third ventricle. So the cavity above the third ventricle here, the two cavities reveals the central parts of each lateral ventricle or the body of each lateral ventricle. In the midline, they are separated by septum pellucidum. Laterally, they will be related to C reveals the body of caudate, and the fibers in between C and L, which is for the lentiform nucleus, will be the internal capsule, anterior limb. And when you move more laterally also in the bottom of the lateral sulcus, you will find the insula. This is a coronal section, but at the level of the posterior horn. This is the shape of the posterior horn of the lateral ventricle. We will find the medial wall. This is elevation called bulb of the posterior horn. It is made by the forceps major. We have another elevation here formed by the calcarine sulcus called calcar aves. What here? Here is the collateral trigone or eminence related to the collateral sulcus. And laterally, it will be related to three structures. D forming the roof and continue to be a lateral wall. This is for the tapetum. Lateral to it, E, we have the optic radiation, and most laterally, it is for the inferior longitudinal fasciculus. And finally, thank you.